The carriage turned off the Exeter Road shortly after noon, and Lady Cordelia Fanshawe adjusted her gloves for the fourth time since they had left the inn at Salisbury. Julian Hale, the 6th Duke of Renfield, noticed this, but said nothing. He had learned, in the 7 weeks of their engagement, that Cordelia adjusted her gloves when she was nervous and touched her collarbone when she was thinking, and that these two states rarely overlapped. Today she was nervous. He could not fault her for it. His mother had opinions. Everyone in 3 counties knew the Dowager Duchess of Renfield had opinions, and that she expressed them with a fluency that made lesser women excuse themselves from drawing rooms. She had buried 1 husband, survived 2 bouts of fever, and maintained a household that ran with the precision of a naval frigate. Her letters arrived on Tuesdays with the regularity of tides, and each one contained, somewhere between the weather report and the closing salutation, an observation so precisely aimed that Julian sometimes suspected she sharpened them the way other women sharpen pencils, habitually, without malice, simply to keep the point fine. When he had written to inform her of his engagement to the eldest daughter of Viscount Fanshawe, her reply had consisted of 4 words: "Bring her to me." He had not brought anyone to her before. There had been no need. His years in London had been occupied first by his education, then by his duties in the House of Lords, where he sat on 3 committees and spoke rarely but well, then by the slow and tiresome business of being the most eligible man in every room he entered without ever finding that the eligibility led anywhere worth arriving. Cordelia had been the sensible choice. She was handsome, well-read, correctly connected, possessed of a fortune that did not embarrass and a temperament that did not alarm. His solicitor approved, his friends approved, his own judgment approved in the way that judgment approves of a well-made boot, admiring the craftsmanship without feeling anything particular about the leather. The house came into view through a break in the elms. Hartwell Lodge was not large by ducal standards. His mother had chosen it deliberately when she left the main estate after his father's death, preferring 12 rooms she could command to 40 she would rattle through. The gardens were her particular triumph, and even from the drive, Julian could see the roses had been ruthless with the south wall, covering it in a profusion of pale pink that softened the gray stone into something almost gentle. Gravel crunched beneath the wheels. The coachman slowed. Somewhere in the house, Julian knew, his mother was already standing. She never sat when she could stand, and never stood when she could hold position like a general surveying terrain. The carriage stopped. The coachman descended. Julian stepped out first and handed Cordelia down. She looked up at the house with the careful, measuring expression of a woman who understood she was being assessed before she crossed the threshold. She smoothed her pelisse. She touched her collarbone. She was thinking now. The front door opened. The woman who stood in the doorway was not his mother. She was perhaps 25, slight and upright in a plain gray wool dress with a white cap that sat neatly over dark hair. She had the kind of face that required a second glance. Unremarkable at first, then suddenly precise, like a passage in a book that meant nothing until one had read the rest of the page. Her eyes were gray and direct and held a quality Julian could not immediately name, something between patience and attention, as though she had been listening to the world for a long time and had drawn certain conclusions she kept to herself. She stepped back to admit them and said, in a voice that carried the particular clarity of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms full of children, "Your Grace, you're expected. May I take your things?" Julian handed her his hat and gloves. Cordelia kept her pelisse. The woman, Ruth, he remembered vaguely, one of his mother's household, led them through the entrance hall toward the morning room. The hall smelled of beeswax and cut flowers and the particular stone and plaster coolness of a house that had stood for 100 years and intended to stand for 100 more. Ruth walked ahead of them with a composure that seemed entirely unconscious, as though she had never considered that walking could be done any other way. Her back was straight without stiffness. Her steps were measured without being slow. She moved through the house the way someone moves through a sentence they have understood completely, with certainty but without hurry. The morning room door was open. His mother stood beside the window in a gown of deep plum silk, her silver hair dressed simply, her posture that of a woman who had never once in her life needed to be told to stand up straight. Afternoon light fell across the carpet in wide, pale bands, catching the dust motes that drifted through the room with the lazy indifference of things that answer to no one. The dowager turned as footsteps approached, and her gaze moved from Julian to the two women who accompanied him. Ruth was slightly ahead. She had turned to gesture Cordelia through, her hand extended toward the room in a practiced movement of deference, but the dowager's eyes had already found her, and something in the older woman's face shifted, not surprise, recognition. A warmth that gathered like light behind glass, sudden and deep and entirely unguarded in a woman who guarded everything. The Dowager Duchess stepped forward, took Ruth's hand in both of her own, and performed a curtsy of such deliberate formality that it could only be intended for a woman she meant to welcome into her family. "My dear girl," she said, and her voice held a softness Julian had not heard since his father's funeral. "At last. I've been so eager to meet the woman my son has chosen." The silence that followed had a texture to it, dense and faintly luminous, like the air before a storm decides whether to break or pass. Ruth stood absolutely still. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her free hand moved fractionally toward her cap, then stopped, as though she had caught herself in the act of remembering what she was. Color rose in her cheeks, not the flush of pleasure, but the deeper bloom of mortification, of being seen as something one is not and having no language to correct it. Cordelia, 3 steps behind, watched with an expression Julian would later recognize as the precise moment understanding arrives ahead of its welcome. "Mother," Julian said. His voice was careful. "This is Ruth. She's part of your household. My fiancée is behind her, Lady Cordelia Fanshawe." The dowager did not release Ruth's hand immediately. That was what Julian noticed first and could not afterwards forget. There was a pause, perhaps 2 seconds, perhaps 3, in which his mother looked at Ruth, and Ruth looked at the floor, and the entire architecture of the afternoon rearranged itself around a mistake that had already said too much. Then the dowager withdrew. Her recovery was immaculate, decades of social mastery compressed into a single pivot. She turned to Cordelia with a smile of practiced warmth and extended her hands. "Lady Cordelia, forgive an old woman her confusion. The light in this hall is dreadful. I must have the candles seen to. You are most welcome." Cordelia curtsied. Her composure held, but Julian saw her glance once at Ruth, who was already retreating toward the door with her head slightly bowed and her hands folded against her skirt in the attitude of someone trying to occupy as little space as the room would allow. The door closed behind her. Luncheon was served in the small dining room, where the windows faced south and the early summer light fell across the table with an indiscriminate generosity that flattered the silver and the crystal and the carefully arranged peonies in equal measure. Mrs. Pruitt, his mother's housekeeper, oversaw the service with the quiet authority of a woman who believed that well-timed soup could solve most domestic crises and had been proved right often enough to maintain the conviction. The food was excellent. Cold roast chicken, asparagus, a syllabub that trembled on the spoon like a small edible apology for the awkwardness in the entrance hall. The dowager was superb. She asked Cordelia about her family, her interests, her opinions on music and literature and the management of country houses. She inquired about Cordelia's watercolors, about her views on the new plantings at Kew, about whether she preferred Mozart or Haydn and why. She listened to the answers with every appearance of satisfaction. Cordelia answered well. She always answered well, Julian thought, with the fluency of a woman who had been raised to perform precisely this kind of audition and had rehearsed it so many times that the rehearsal itself had become invisible. But something was absent. Julian could feel it the way one feels a draft in a room where every window appears shut, not the thing itself, but the evidence of its passage. His mother was correct in every particular and warm in none. She praised Cordelia's opinions and asked after her father's health and complimented the cut of her traveling dress, and not once did she look at Cordelia the way she had looked at Ruth in the entrance hall. That look. Julian returned to it throughout the meal the way a tongue returns to a chipped tooth. His mother had not simply mistaken one woman for another. She had recognized something, and recognized it with a certainty that preceded information that operated on a frequency below the reach of logic or introduction. His mother had met Ruth before. He knew this distantly, something about a school visit. But the dowager met dozens of people in the course of her charitable rounds, and she did not curtsy to any of them. After luncheon, Cordelia was shown to her room to rest. Julian found his mother in the garden, cutting roses with a pair of silver-handled shears that had belonged to his grandmother. The afternoon had turned warm, and the smell of the roses was thick and sweet and slightly overwhelming, like a compliment delivered without restraint. "You might tell me," he said, standing beside her while she decapitated a bloom that had committed the offense of opening unevenly, "how you came to mistake my housemaid for my fiancée." The dowager cut another rose. "She is not your housemaid. She is mine." The distinction does not answer the question. His mother set the shears down on the stone bench and regarded him with the expression she reserved for moments when she intended to be honest and expected him to be equal to it. "I met her 18 months ago. Lady Albright took me to the parish school in the village. She funds it, as you know, and wanted my opinion on whether the building required repair. I expected nothing. A drafty room, a tired schoolmistress, children reciting their letters with the enthusiasm of prisoners." She paused. A blackbird landed on the garden wall and considered them both with professional indifference. "Instead," the dowager continued, "I found a woman teaching 12 children the movement of the planets using an apple and a candle. She had placed the candle on a stool in the center of the room and was walking the apple around it in an ellipse, explaining why the seasons change, why the days lengthen, why the light moves across the floor of a room differently in January than in June. Every child in the room was silent, not the silence of discipline, the silence of fascination. I have attended lectures at the Royal Institution that commanded less attention." She picked up the shears. "I stayed for an hour. She did not know who I was. Afterwards, she spoke to me about the children, which ones were falling behind, and why, what she would do with funds for new slates, how she had fashioned a multiplication table from a piece of sailcloth because the old one had rotted. She was not asking me for money. She was simply thinking aloud, the way people do when they have forgotten to be careful about who is listening." The dowager cut a stem with surgical precision. "Her father was the Reverend Sayer of Thorndon, a man of learning, Greek, Latin, astronomy, botany. He taught her everything he would have taught a son. When he died, the living went to a cousin. She had nothing, no family of means, no fortune, no prospects. She came into service because there was nowhere else to come. And you hired her." "I hired her because she was wasted anywhere that did not use her mind. She reads to me in the evenings, properly, not the way most people read aloud, which is merely noise arranged in sequence. She manages my correspondence when Selwyn is occupied with the accounts. She reorganizes my library without being asked and is always right about where things should go. Last month, she corrected an error in the household ledger that Selwyn had missed, a discrepancy of 14 shillings that she found simply because the number looked wrong to her and she could not leave it alone." The dowager examined a rose as though it had personally offended her. "When you wrote to say you were engaged, I assumed you had found a woman of that quality. When she walked through the door, I believed my assumption had been correct." Julian said nothing for a long time. The blackbird departed. The roses continued to be magnificent and disorganized. "You were telling me," he said carefully, "that you curtsied to a maid because you believed she was the kind of woman I ought to marry. I am telling you that I curtsied to the woman I believed you had chosen. I was mistaken about the choosing, not about the woman." He left his mother in the garden and walked through the house without purpose, passing through rooms he had known since childhood, and finding them altered, as though someone had shifted every piece of furniture 2 inches to the left and the eye kept catching on distances that were no longer quite right. In the library, he found evidence of Ruth's influence. Books reshelved by subject rather than size, a folio of botanical illustrations moved from a high shelf to one within reach, small cards tucked inside covers indicating pages last read. A globe near the window had been turned so that England faced the room, a minor adjustment that changed nothing and everything about how the space felt. These were not the acts of a servant. They were the acts of someone who understood a house the way a musician understands an instrument, through constant, attentive, invisible care. He found Ruth in the still room that evening, cataloging preserves by the light of a single candle. The shelves behind her held rows of jars labeled in a hand that was small and neat and absolutely legible. The handwriting of a woman who had been taught that clarity was a form of courtesy. She turned when he entered and performed a curtsy that was correct in every technical particular and devastating in its formality. "Your Grace." "Ruth." He realized he had never said her name before, and that it sounded different aloud than it did in the part of his mind where he had apparently been keeping it without permission. "I wanted to assure you that you need feel no discomfort about what occurred this morning. My mother's error was her own and reflects nothing upon you." She looked at him with an expression he could not read, or rather, an expression he could read perfectly, but did not wish to acknowledge because it would require him to admit that she was managing this conversation with more grace than he was. "Thank you, Your Grace. You are very kind." And then she returned to her preserves with a steadiness that he recognized, with a lurch of something he could not immediately name, as composure maintained its significant cost. He climbed the stairs slowly. On the landing, he passed a window that overlooked the kitchen garden, and through it, he could see the herb beds where Ruth had been reading that morning before anyone else had risen. The book she had left on the garden wall was still there, a small volume in brown leather, the pages riffled by the evening breeze. Something about its solitude, the way it sat waiting for a reader who would return to it without fail, made him stop and stand at the window longer than the view warranted. That evening, Cordelia played the pianoforte after dinner. She played well, Handel, one of the pieces his mother favored, with a technical precision that left nothing to chance and nothing to discovery. His mother listened with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap. Ruth moved through the room at intervals, replacing candles, adjusting a curtain against the draft, and each time she passed, Julian tracked her movement with a vigilance he could not suppress and could not explain. When Cordelia finished, the dowager applauded with genuine appreciation and said the piece had been beautifully executed. The word "executed" hung in the air a moment longer than it should have. Later, after Cordelia had retired, the dowager remained in the drawing room with a book she was not reading. Julian stood by the fire and tried to identify the source of his unease, which had grown throughout the day from a faint irritation to something closer to alarm. "She plays beautifully," the dowager said, not looking up from her page. "She does. And she is handsome and well-bred and entirely suitable." "Yes." His mother turned a page she had not read. "Then I am delighted." She was not delighted. They both knew she was not delighted. The distance between what his mother said and what she meant had never been larger than this room, and Julian stood in the middle of it, feeling the walls contract. The following morning, he rose before the household and walked the grounds in the thin early light. The dawn was soft and pale, the kind of English morning that promises nothing specific and delivers everything. Birdsong, dew, the smell of cut grass, and somewhere the first suggestion of rain. The sky was the color of weak tea. Mist clung to the lower garden like gauze over a wound. He walked toward the kitchen garden and stopped when he heard a voice. Ruth was sitting on the low wall beside the herb beds, reading aloud from the brown leather volume he had seen from the landing window. Not to anyone visible, simply reading, the way one does when the words require air to breathe properly. It was Cowper, he realized after a moment, the passage about the garden as a place of restoration, where the wounded mind finds itself again among simple growing things. Her voice carried the words without performance, without effort, the way water carries a leaf, because the current moves that way and there is no reason to resist it. Morning light caught the edge of her cap and the line of her jaw and the small crease between her brows that appeared when she concentrated. She saw him and stopped. She stood. She smoothed her skirts and held the book against her chest like a shield, and for a moment they stood in the garden with the mist around their ankles, and the silence between them filled with the sound of everything neither of them could say. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not expect— Please do not stop on my account." She looked at him, and he understood that she was trying to determine whether this was an instruction from a duke or a request from a man, and that she did not know how to obey both simultaneously. He wanted to tell her it was the latter. He did not, because he was engaged to another woman, and the words would have been unforgivable. He walked away instead. His hands were in fists at his sides, and he did not unclench them until he reached the house. Mrs. Pruitt served breakfast with the silent efficiency of a woman who had seen enough domestic weather to know when a storm was forming and had the good sense not to comment on the barometric pressure. Julian sat through the meal, watching Cordelia butter her toast with geometric precision, and his mother pour her tea with the steady hand of someone who would not permit a teapot to tremble under any circumstances, and he felt the morning close around him like a room with no door. After breakfast, Cordelia asked to walk in the garden. They walked together along the gravel path, past the roses, past the sundial with its shadow pointing accusingly toward the house, past the stone bench where his mother had spoken her quiet devastation the day before. Cordelia's hand rested lightly on his arm. She was silent for some time, and Julian understood that she was composing something. Not words exactly, but the architecture of a conclusion she had already reached. "Your mother does not approve of me," she said at last, and her voice was steady and factual in a way that cost her something Julian could see but could not reach. "She approves of you entirely. She approves of my qualifications, Julian. She does not approve of me. There is a difference, and I think you know it." He did not deny it. Cordelia deserved better than denial, and she would have identified it immediately in any case. "She curtsied to that girl," Cordelia continued, and her tone held neither jealousy nor accusation, but something more difficult: comprehension. And she meant it. Not the social gesture, the act. She lowered herself before a woman in a gray dress and a white cap, and she meant every inch of it. She has not looked at me once with anything approaching that conviction, though she has performed every courtesy with absolute correctness. Cordelia stopped walking and withdrew her hand from his arm. The gesture was gentle but final, like the closing of a well-made book. "Tell me this. When you think of the years ahead, the mornings and the evenings and the long afternoons in whichever house we occupy, do you see them with clarity? Can you see the breakfast table?" Julian tried. He tried to see Cordelia across his table at Renfield, pouring tea, buttering toast, speaking about the day's engagements with the same fluent competence she brought to everything. He could see the table. He could see the room. He could see the light through the east windows and the coffee service his father had commissioned from a silversmith in Bath. What he could not see, and the failure struck him with the force of something physical, was wanting to be there. "I see it," he said, "but I'm not in it." Cordelia nodded. Her eyes were bright, but she did not weep. Not then, and not later, though Mrs. Pruitt would say afterwards that she heard someone crying quietly in the guest room that afternoon, and that the sound had the particular quality of grief that belongs to a woman who has been right about something she wished she had been wrong about. "Then we should not proceed," Cordelia said. "I will not marry a man who is absent from his own breakfast table." "Cordelia, do not apologize. An apology would make it worse, and I find I have very little tolerance for things that are worse today." She released his arm with the care of someone setting down something fragile that is already cracked. "You have been honorable throughout, and I will speak well of you after, and that is all either of us owes the other." She walked back toward the house alone, her posture as correct as it had been when she arrived, her gloves adjusted for the final time. Julian remained in the garden until the light changed. He heard distantly the sounds of departure, a trunk carried downstairs, the crunch of gravel under carriage wheels, a brief exchange of courtesies at the front door conducted with the quiet competence of people who understood that some things required no ceremony to be complete. When the carriage pulled away, he watched from the garden wall and felt not relief, but the hollow clarity that follows a decision one did not know one had already made. He did not speak to Ruth that day or the next. He would not compound one dishonor with another. He returned to London, attended to his affairs, sat through 3 sessions in the House of Lords, during which he voted on matters of agricultural reform, with a diligence that surprised his colleagues, and wrote 7 letters to his mother that said nothing about Ruth and everything about the weather and the progress of roadworks on the Bath Road and a new method of draining clay soil that he had read about in a pamphlet and found moderately interesting. His mother's replies were similarly procedural, with one exception. In her 3rd letter, she mentioned that Ruth had reorganized the music library and discovered a folio of Handel that had been missing for 6 years. "She is remarkable," the Dowager wrote, "in a hand that betrayed nothing, for finding things that others have mislaid." Julian read this sentence 4 times and then put the letter in his desk drawer, where it remained for the rest of the season and where he looked at it more often than he would have admitted to anyone, including himself. He returned to Hartwell Lodge in September, when the roses had spent themselves, and the garden had settled into the comfortable dishevelment of early autumn. Leaves the color of old bronze gathered along the edges of the gravel paths. The light had changed, thinner, sharper, stripped of summer's indulgence. He told his mother he had come to review the accounts with Selwyn. His mother said nothing to this, which was her way of saying everything. He found Ruth in the library on his second morning, reshelving a set of sermons his mother had been reading. The room smelled of old leather and beeswax, and the particular papery warmth of books that had been handled with care. She turned when he entered and curtsied, the same correct formal curtsy as before, and said, "Your Grace, I would like to speak with you," he said, not as the Duke of Renfield to a member of his mother's household, but as a man who has spent 3 months trying not to think about a woman reading Cowper in a herb garden at dawn, and who has failed at that task more thoroughly than he has failed at anything in his life. Ruth set the book down on the shelf beside her. Her hands were steady, but her breathing was not. "You were engaged 3 months ago, Your Grace." "I was. The engagement ended because the woman I was to marry saw more clearly than I did, and had the courage to say so. Lady Cordelia ended it. She told me I was absent from my own breakfast table. She was right. I was present in the room and absent from the life, and she was unwilling to be married to a chair." Ruth's composure held, but something shifted behind her eyes, a light coming on in a room that had been deliberately kept dark. "I'm a clergyman's daughter in service," she said. "I have no fortune, no family of consequence, nothing to recommend me, except what your mother's generosity has allowed me to be in this house. You cannot marry me, because your mother curtsied to me by mistake." "My mother did not curtsy to you by mistake. She curtsied to you by instinct, which is considerably more reliable. And I'm not proposing because my mother curtsied. I'm proposing because every room you have touched in this house is better arranged than any room I have occupied in London, and because you read Cowper aloud to no one at 6 in the morning, and because when I try to see the years ahead, you are the only figure in them I do not have to invent. The Ton will not accept it. The Ton accepted my grandfather marrying a woman whose father made his fortune in cotton. They will accept anything if the Duke is certain. And I am certain." Ruth looked at him, and he saw in her expression not the composure he had admired before, but the effort beneath it, the cost of holding oneself together when the thing one has not permitted oneself to want is suddenly standing in the room offering itself without condition. Her eyes were bright. Her chin was steady. She was, he thought, exactly the woman his mother had seen in the entrance hall, not the credentials or the connections or the fortune, but the irreducible thing beneath all of it, the quality that could not be taught or purchased or performed, and that announced itself, to those paying attention, like light entering a room. "I will not say yes today," she said. "If you are certain, you will still be certain in a month. I will be certain next month and the month after that, and every month following until they carry me out of whatever room you are in. But I will wait." He waited. He returned to Hartwell Lodge every fortnight through the autumn, arriving on Friday evenings and departing on Monday mornings with the reluctance of a man leaving a country he has only just discovered exists. He did not bring gifts. She would have refused them, and he understood instinctively that the courtship Ruth required was not one of objects but of attention. He brought questions. He asked about the books she was reading and the children at the parish school, and whether Cowper was really better than Thomson, and what she would do with the East Garden if it were hers to manage. She answered carefully at first, then with increasing freedom, and then with the kind of fluency that only emerges when someone has stopped monitoring themselves for error and begun to trust that the listener is equal to what is being said. In November, on a morning when the frost had turned the garden silver, and their breath hung in the library air, and the light through the windows was thin and pale and honest in the way that only winter light can be, she said yes. They married in December, in the chapel at Renfield Park, with the dowager seated in the front pew wearing an expression of such concentrated satisfaction that the vicar later told his wife it was the most terrifying and the most moving thing he had witnessed in 30 years of ministry. Ruth wore a gown of ivory silk, simple, high-waisted, without ornament, except a sprig of winter jasmine in her hair that the dowager had cut from the conservatory that morning. Julian, standing at the altar watching her walk toward him, understood for the first time what his mother had recognized in the entrance hall at Hartwell Lodge, Not beauty, not breeding, not any of the things the world measured and ranked and married for, but the rarer thing beneath, a woman who was entirely, unperformably herself. Mrs. Pruitt wept through the ceremony and denied it afterwards with a conviction that persuaded no one. Selwyn, who had served the family for 19 years and had never been known to express an emotion more intense than mild professional satisfaction, was observed to smile twice. 3 months after the wedding, a letter arrived at Renfield Park addressed to the Duchess of Renfield. Ruth opened it at the breakfast table, their breakfast table, the one Julian now occupied with the thorough, undistracted presence of a man who has learned what it costs to be absent, and he watched her face as she read. "Lady Cordelia is engaged," Ruth said, "to a Mr. Alderton of Devonshire. She says he is present at every meal and has never once appeared to be thinking about the weather." She set the letter down and smiled, not the careful smile of composure, but the unguarded one beneath it, the one Julian had spent months earning the right to see. "She also says she is glad it happened as it did, and that she bears no ill will toward anyone in this house." Julian took the letter and read it himself. It was generous and clear-eyed and entirely Cordelia, and he felt a gratitude toward her that he could not adequately express and did not attempt to, except in a reply that took him 3 drafts and that Ruth, reading over his shoulder, corrected twice for tone. The following spring, a daughter was born. They named her Frances, after Julian's grandmother, and the dowager held her in the morning room at Hartwell Lodge with an expression that could only be described as triumph, refined to its most dignified possible form. Ruth sat in the chair beside the window, tired and luminous in the April light, and Julian sat beside her and did not think about being anywhere else and did not need to try. It was Mrs. Pruitt who told the story in the end, as housekeepers always do, being the true and unofficial historians of any great house. She told it to the new kitchen maid and to the gardener's wife, and eventually to anyone who stood still long enough to hear it. How the Dowager Duchess of Renfield had curtsied to a maid, how the Duke had watched and not understood, how the right woman had been standing in the doorway all along, opening the door and leading them in, as though she had always known where they were meant to go. Years later, when Frances was old enough to ask, Ruth told her daughter about the morning she had opened the front door, and a Dowager Duchess had curtsied to her as though she were the woman her son had chosen. She told it simply, without embellishment, the way she told everything, as though the truth required no decoration to be worth hearing. "What did you do?" Frances asked. "I stood very still," Ruth said. "I did not know what else to do." "Were you frightened?" Ruth considered this. Outside the library window, the garden at Renfield was in full summer bloom, and somewhere in the house, Julian was reading correspondence with the particular sigh he reserved for letters from his solicitor, a sound so familiar to her now that its absence would have been louder than its presence. "No," she said. "I was recognized. They arrive here like a curtsy offered before the world was ready to understand it, whenever they are ready."